Guilty Gear XX Accent Core Plus, the fourth game this time on the series that follows up from one of the characters' possible endings on the Guilty Gear X2 storyline, introducing a few new characters and new set of moves while changing the branching story setup into a more interconnected one. Now, considering there's a bunch of different versions of the game, I end up choosing the second version instead, the one that includes a story and not the PC Steam ported version, since the Plus R port had some bit of updates already, with its HUD, online multiplayer setup, Robokai's theme, and a couple of the characters' movesets. I wanted to choose the more preserved version of it, as for now, the one I'm also familiar with the most. This is K1PM. Today I'll be doing a full review of Guilty Gear XX Accent Core Plus. I'll be going more in depth about the game and pointing out the pros and the cons of it. The game was developed by Arc System Works, the same ones who've also developed these games that you might know. Guilty Gear games were the real deal when it comes to the fast-paced fighting games, and the ones who introduced that instant kill move or the destroy ability that are risky to pull off in between, along with its unique take on the story, following a decently long branching storyline before, with some moderate to overwhelmingly hard story battles, including the other difficult game modes that challenges the player to its limits. Well, at least there's a difficulty change on the options over here that affects the story and arcade battles, giving more room for the newer players to experience it. Unlike before was, well, you just gotta get good. As I mentioned a while ago, the plot follows up from the previous game on Guilty Gear X2, from one of and each of the characters' three possible endings on the story mode. After the events with Ino's plan and the deployment of multiple Robokai on the field, the mysterious organization that sent a bunch of Robokais around turns out to be the PWAB, or known as the Post-War Administration Bureau. The whole plan they've set up before had them getting targeted by different factions and people in turn, namely from the nation of ZEP, IPF or International Police Force, Jellyfish Pirates, Assassin's Guild depending on the path, and the other individuals that had affairs with them. Kuro Kuroaba, the scientist and the branch chief of the PWAB, took action of defending part of the PWAB branches, and removing any research and valuable information within their facilities, while conducting experiments with his new prototype creation of Justice Copy, the same last boss on their first game on the PS1. He also used a certain device that can create physical holograms based on their database. That includes the older version of Soul Bad Guy as Order Soul, Cliff Anderson, the leader of the Sacred Order of Holy Knights, and even Jam Kuradoberi, the present time during this game. There's also still with the faction of That Man, but it still feels somewhat short for them, how it just involves them on recapturing Ino again while getting involved with Soul Bad Guy's ending. Now, as do most fighting games, depending on the character you choose follows their own perspective and paths, mostly in a simpler and linear storyline, while others has a different minor ending. What's unique for this game, it has its own branching story paths, but this time a more interconnected one compared to before. Not only in a way of having the same scenarios as with the other characters, but it also changes and adds extra bits of dialogues in there that you don't exactly find out unless if you're gonna play on the other character for that scene. Although the conditions of moving on to a different branch of a story is still there. Remember the whole searching for which of these conditions meets that would lead you to a different path? Yeah, it's still there. Although some endings for other characters are much more easier to accomplish, given that there's an extra option to choose which path you would lead to. But for most of the other characters, after those choices, you still have to guess which of these conditions afterwards. Not to mention, there's also the conditions of completing the other characters' endings first, but at least it's much more lesser than before. There's also a change on the number of endings for each character. It was shortened from 3 endings to become 2 instead, possibly in a way to give priority onto the improved longer storyline. Not to mention, they also removed the whole mini animation on some parts of the endings. It ends up mostly in a still image in the end. I know it's just a minor thing, but it's a bit disappointing on how they downgraded for that part. It was rather a unique setup for a visual novel kind of game. I mean, a fighting game with a visual novel kind of setup for the story. Putting aside that, as much as I love their expanded branching storyline, it's a bit disappointing how a few of their scenarios feels kinda rushed or seem nonsensical at times, that it felt like padding for some parts of their story instead. At the very least, for most characters were actually alright, with the addition of adding to its lore, before it ends up getting a rewrite on some parts of the story on the newer games. Yeah, unfortunately not everything within the story here is canon.
Please select your character.
Guilty Gear XX Accent Core Plus has a wide range of diverse set of characters, totaling up to 25 this time with 2 new playable characters. Well, it's somewhat like 3 new ones considering Robo-Kai had a major rework, both his personality and movesets. It's kinda a bit shorter compared to the 4 newer ones on the Guilty Gear X2, but they've still managed to have a pretty good lineup. Cliff and Justice are still available, yet needed to be unlocked through story mode, while Order Soul has a unique kind of style that's a lot similar to the first Guilty Gear, returning the whole charge level special attacks while being able to charge them in between combos this time. It kinda feels like Order Soul has a lot of potential with him. While ABA or ABBA, on the other hand, actually came from a spin-off game called Guilty Gear Isuka. She ends up getting to the main series later on. Back then, I didn't manage to practice on her set that much, but when I started to go back to this game again, I didn't expect that I would actually like her aggressive kind of playstyle, while getting on her HP drain from her own attacks as a cons. It's a bit harder to master, but a tough opponent to beat. Although the HP drains seem a bit too fast from what I experienced. I don't know. I must have been going too aggressive when playing as her. I could be wrong though, so take it as a grain of salt. Aside from that, there's also the rework for Robo-Kai. He finally has his own unique set of moves and not just an alternate copy of Kai from Guilty Gear X. Not to mention the added extra personality for him was a good touch to its character.
お前はわしの嫁になるんだよ。
ごめんなさい。みんなが待ってるから買い物の途中なんです。
ダメ
Pair it up with its unconventional set of moves, I actually end up liking him better than before. When it comes to the main gameplay mechanics, nothing pretty much changed from what I remembered. The destroy or instant kill move is still there, while in this training state, well, there's the addition of giving Dizzy her own destroy move. Finally, despite her destroy ability setup is a bit longer compared to the others, Ino still does her unique special in the story and arcade mode, while the other mechanics in the game are still there, except for the charge thing that was left for good on the first one, but only returned for Order Soul's unique playstyle. Although they did added one new mechanic that wasn't on the previous ones before. It's these short special moves that ends up amplifying the character's attacks, either by making it a bit stronger or letting the enemy bounce more and such.
それが君の空気だ。忘れるなよ。はしゃいでんじゃねえ。Heaven or hell, final, let's rock.
As I've tried playing every character and managed to finish every story path and options they have, except for every missions and survival mode because it's really hard. When it comes to the overall movesets for every characters, I kinda hate to say it, but it's somewhat still unbalanced for me. Well, not much, but kinda feels a little. But hey, it did manage to improve compared to before, on the amount of movesets and combos to set up for every character. That's at least on the PS2 version though. It might vary on the ports, like on the Plus R version on Steam. Perhaps the whole EX, Shadow, and Gold versions of their character must have messed up for the developers in my opinion. Having separate sets of movesets for a character, while giving them unlimited specials and such depending on you choose, can be a confusing way to balance the whole thing after all. As you know by now, there's a story, arcade mode, versus, and the new team versus. These are the usual common ones that a fighting game has, but Guilty Gear has these 3 other modes that's the same as the previous game it has. Mission mode allows the player to select a challenge to beat. Some aren't that hard but in a unique condition to fight against, while the others are outright hell to beat. MOM or Medal of Millionaire mod is more of a survival scoring competition. The more you fill up the meter with combos, the more enemy drop points and HP items in between. Then there's the survival mode. Forces you to battle a set of enemies that comes with absurdly stronger ones later on. Fighting the really difficult ones in the end that would test your skill to your limit. Not only in a way of how smarter the enemy can be, but how the handicap is huge when fighting against them. Overall though, these modes are actually alright to do. The survival mode did add some new mechanic in it. A bit of RPG-ish element when it comes to the stats of a character in a survival mode. For a fighting game with that kind of setting, it's pretty interesting how they add that up. Though in some cases, I couldn't understand what's written on it. Like, this power-up somehow gave me a thunder attack power-up? But for some reason I can't see the effects on it. Or in some cases, I don't even understand what's written on the buffs. You know, a bit more information would be really helpful in this case. Aside from that, the training is still the same as before. It managed to get a huge improvement from before, while now it's currently decent as it is. The only changes are the HUD part. Or so I think, if I remember that correctly. There's no denying that the game looks amazing as a 2D fighting game. The game clearly aged well despite its release for years, that ends up getting ported several times through different consoles. The unique character design for each one of them, along with their smooth animation of every move they pull off, are the remarkable part of its looks. Paired up with some decent to great background stages, I'm wondering how they still managed to improve its style for years. More so when the game added alternate versions for most of the stages. While they even added back the small touches how the background of the stages responds to some of the characters' movements when in battle. A feature that was only present in the Guilty Gear X version that was gone on the X2. Despite its numerous changes to its art style on every main series of their games, this one seems to be the most decent one out of all. Though, personally, I kinda prefer the older portraits if I'd be honest with you. The new ones seem a bit more towards the anime-ish kind, which is not bad in a way, but it kinda loses its charm in it. You know what I mean? It's kinda like the case with the Castlevania series, when they transitioned their games into more towards the anime-ish a bit too heavily, for a time at least. Now the game's soundtrack is easily one of the best ones during its time, especially when comparing to its genre of music within video games. How each of the characters' themes has its own personality that blends very fittingly for each of the character. From Baiken's brash personality paired with an assertive theme, to Mei's playful personality paired fittingly with its adventurous theme. And then when you start listening to Milia, Kai, or even Jan's theme, you'd be surprised how decent they managed to set it up. Just try listening to the game's soundtrack. It's great how memorable most of it can be. Except for one character, Robo-Kai's theme. For some reason, the PS2 version theme of Robo-Kai oddly sounds like this. I've tried looking up online, but surprisingly, there's not a single info as to why this sounds very differently as to compared with the other themes out there. I'm guessing it must be a version of the port or something. The devs does have a habit of creating multiple different versions of the game after all. Like the case on the Korean version of Guilty Gear X2 Reload. It has a completely entire different soundtrack as to compare with the global or Japanese versions. Yeah, I know. Even I'm so surprised by it. Who would expect the consideration of changing in a soundtrack of a game would come to mind with the developers for a fighting game? Now there are some games that considers it, like the case with Oso Tatakai Wendan for the Japanese version, and the Elite beat agents in the American version or in the global side of things. But again, in a fighting game? Oh well. That's why I give this game a rating of 8.6 out of 10. Guilty Gear XX Action Core Plus still lives up to its name in the series. The constant unique fast-paced battles along with a set of very diverse characters what makes the game stands out a lot. Although, as an experienced player of the older series, Guilty Gear XX Action Core Plus haven't changed that much compared to its previous one, Guilty Gear X2. But it at least managed to polish the game even further, making the Action Core version better compared to its previous successor, more so on the Plus R version afterwards, as in the one on the other consoles or even on Steam. Well, aside from that, they did added some other things. Added 2 new unique characters, a complete rework for Robo-Kai and the other characters' moves, alternate version stages, storyline for Cliff, along with the other extra challenges like on the other modes and on the missions part. The rest of it are pretty much the same thing as before, but it's all good though. If you're looking for the story part itself, it did improve in some ways, yet it still bears the same problem. At the very least, it didn't went for a Guilty Gear Isuka's route. How the changes were kinda a bit too much for the main series to handle. For those who wanted to try out the game, I suggest to go for the Guilty Gear XX Action Core Plus R version in Steam. Arc System Works games that they release on Steam usually goes in sale after all. I bought mine like around less than $3 for a 80% sale. You could look it up at their Steam store over there. For more videos such as these, why not head down to my channel to check things out? I do accurate game reviews of the past games, and some other new ones too. If you consider subscribing to my channel, please do follow me on my Twitter account for more updates. In case something bad might happen all of a sudden, there's still a way to contact me over there. This is K1PM, and I bid you farewell.